Welcome to Fontaine Fifth Wheel's Maintenance and Rebuild Procedures. In these next few minutes, we will show you proper preventive maintenance and step-by-step instructions for rebuilding your 5092 series fifth wheel, a fifth wheel designed to require minimum maintenance, adjustment, and repair. For maximum performance, we recommend that your fifth wheel and mounting brackets be steam cleaned and inspected every 90 days or 30,000 miles. After a thorough steam cleaning, begin your inspection by visually checking the fifth wheel assembly, top plate, mounting brackets, mounting parts, and all moving parts for cracks, excessive wear, loose or missing bolts, or any other damage. Look to make sure that nothing is hanging loose under the fifth wheel. No loose cotter pins, springs, or bolts. Check the retainer pin and cotter pin located on the band of the fifth wheel. Now, make sure your fifth wheel locking mechanism is functioning properly. Begin with the fifth wheel in the unlocked position, the handle extended, and the throat of the fifth wheel unobstructed. Insert a test kingpin. Make sure the jaw and wedge mechanism engages behind the kingpin and the pull handle is fully retracted and in the secondary safety lock position. Notice only minimal force is required to couple a Fontaine fifth wheel. Next, see that the leaf spring has proper tension to keep the pull handle in its secure position. To open, lift the pull handle to clear the secondary lock and pull out until the fifth wheel is securely locked in the open position. If the wheel is hard to open, it may be due to a tight or unlubricated wedge. The wedge can be released by hitting the end of the spring-loaded wedge stop rod with a hammer. Note the wedge stop rod extends from the skirt of the fifth wheel and is located on the opposite side of the fifth wheel from the pull handle. Now, check the wedge stop rod adjustment by pushing the wedge stop rod until it touches the end of the wedge and springs back. When coupled, the rod travel should be 1/4 of an inch. To check this adjustment when not coupled, insert a test kingpin into the throat of the fifth wheel and make sure the jaw and wedge mechanism engages before checking the rod travel. Again, push the wedge stop rod until it touches the end of the wedge and springs back. The rod travel should be 1/4 of an inch. Turn the rod clockwise to reduce free travel of the rod to 1/4 of an inch. Turn the rod counterclockwise to increase free travel of the rod to 1/4 of an inch. Mushrooming of the bearing surfaces of the stationary and movable jaws is a sign that the wedge stop rod is not being properly adjusted. Failure to adjust the wedge stop rod will result in slack and faster wear of both the fifth wheel and kingpin. Sooner or later, this will also result in early replacement of the jaw and wedge. Proper setting of the wedge stop rod ensures successful operation of Fontaine's patented automatic slack adjustment feature and helps keep your fifth wheel on the road. Finally, all moving parts should be lubricated. There is a grease fitting on each side of the wheel to supply lubricant to the bracket bearings. These should be greased with the fifth wheel in an unloaded condition. Rock the wheel back and forth while applying the grease. Some grease should flow from the bearing pockets when the grease reservoir is filled. If you do not see grease coming from the bearing pocket, lift up the top plate to allow grease to flow into the bearing area. Lightly grease the front half of the upper assembly, then apply liberal amounts of grease to the back half of the upper assembly so that grease will be spread up over the fifth wheel with the trailer kingpin plate. Also, grease the jaw at the front of the fifth wheel and be sure all moving parts are lubricated with a heavy 90-weight oil. If during the inspection there appears to be excessive slack in the fifth wheel that cannot be taken out by adjusting the wedge stop rod, rebuilding the wheel may be necessary. Before rebuilding, check the kingpin for excessive wear. Generally, anything more than 1/8 of an inch is considered excessive. Before disassembly of your fifth wheel, be sure that you have purchased a Fontaine kit RPR 5092L for a left release fifth wheel, or kit RPR 5092R for a right release or any other parts you require from your Fontaine dealer or distributor. First, steam clean all exposed surfaces on the fifth wheel. Remove cotter pins from the retaining pins on both sides and remove lower bracket pins. Then, using a hoist or lift, remove the fifth wheel from its brackets. Turn the wheel upside down on a sturdy work surface and thoroughly steam clean the underside. Remember, as with any type of maintenance procedure, exercise extreme caution and follow all stated and customary safety procedures when performing this operation. Above all, be sure to wear safety glasses throughout this procedure. Now, let's begin. First, make sure your fifth wheel is in the closed position. Unhook the bumper spring from the bumper tang and the tab on the side of the fifth wheel. Remove the bumper spring. Using a 3/4-inch wrench, remove the 2 bolts on the operating handle. Each bolt has a nut, washer, and bushing. Discard the bushings. Remove the cotter pin and washer securing the pull handle to the operating handle. Then slide the pull handle out through the side of the fifth wheel. Now slide the operating handle over to the side of the fifth wheel. Slide the bottom part first. This will allow the handle to clear the jaw and wedge studs as well as the timer. Remove the timer by lifting upward. Slide the operating handle out through the slot in the rear crossmember of the fifth wheel. Slide the bumper toward the operating handle slot and to the rear of the fifth wheel until the bumper tang clears the operating handle slot. Lift upward and remove. Make sure the jaw and wedge spring cotter pins are in place before beginning this next procedure, as the wedge spring is under extreme tension. Always wear safety glasses and do not stand directly over the springs. Remove the cotter pin securing the jaw spring and lift the spring from the boss. This spring is under slight tension but can be easily removed. This is not the case with the lower wedge spring. Extreme caution should be used while removing the spring. Remove the cotter pin securing the wedge spring and pry the small hook tail of the spring up over the stud. Standing well to one side, use a screwdriver to pry the spring upward and release the tension. Remove and discard both the cotter pin and spring. Finally, remove first the wedge, then the jaw, and discard both parts. Thoroughly clean this area. Now you have completely disassembled your fifth wheel, and it's time to begin reassembly. Before beginning to reassemble your fifth wheel, we must again stress the importance of working safely. Be sure to wear safety glasses for the following procedures. Now it's time to begin reassembly of your fifth wheel with Fontaine's Rebuild Kit RPR 5092L or Kit RPR 5092R. Begin by inserting a test kingpin into the throat of the fifth wheel. Apply a moderate amount of grease with EP additives to the sides and serrated edges of the new jaw and wedge. Insert the jaw and position it at the top of the housing so that when the jaw slides in place, the radius will be against the kingpin. Then insert the wedge behind the jaw. Insert the wedge spring through the slot in the crossmember and install the spring coil over the spring boss. Using a spring installation tool, place the small hook tail of the spring onto the pin of the tool. Turn the tool counterclockwise until the hook is directly over the stud. Using a hammer, tap the spring downward until the hook is seated on the stud, making sure the coils of the spring are around the boss and the holes for the cotter pin are exposed. Again, at this point, the spring has a great deal of tension. Do not lean directly over the spring, and always wear your safety glasses. Secure the spring with a new cotter pin. Since the jaw spring has only slight tension, it is easily installed by hand. Place the spring coils over the boss with the small hook around the stud. Secure with a new cotter pin. Use a screwdriver or pliers to pry the large hook of each spring onto the jaw and wedge studs. Now, place the bumper back in position, sliding the bumper tang through the operating handle guide slot and toward the tab on the side of the fifth wheel. Apply a liberal amount of grease to the grooved middle section of the operating handle. Insert the operating handle and move it over to the side of the fifth wheel. Apply grease to both sides of the timer as well as to the jaw and wedge studs. Insert the timer over the jaw and wedge studs. The small hole on the timer fits over the jaw stud and the slotted hole fits over the wedge stud. Be certain that the small bent arm of the timer is facing downward. Slide the operating handle toward the center of the fifth wheel to engage the handle with the jaw and wedge studs. Slide the top part first. This will ensure that the grooves on the operating handle are aligned with the studs. A correctly aligned operating handle should be in a vertical position once it is over the studs. Slide the pull handle through the safety lock on the side of the fifth wheel. Using the cotter pin and washer, secure the pull handle in the hole of the operating handle. Apply grease to the bolt hole in the operating handle. Slide the bumper from left to right, aligning the hole in the bumper on top of the hole in the operating handle. Replace the bolts on the operating handle. The bolt which fastens the operating handle to the bumper must be inserted from the underside with the threads facing toward you. The head of the bolt should be positioned against the underside of the operating handle. Insert the bushing over the bolt and through the hole in the bumper. Place a washer on top of the bushing and hand tighten the nut. It is important that the head of the bolt be between the operating handle and spring boss so there is clearance for the handle to open. Improper installation will cause the end of the bolt to strike the spring boss and prevent the fifth wheel from opening. Apply grease to the operating handle's rear bolt hole and the pad around the pivot hole where the operating handle will be secured. Align the bolt hole in the handle with the hole in the pad and insert the bushing. Insert the bolt and washer from above and hand tighten the nut under the pad. Both bolts may now be securely tightened with wrenches. It is important to remember that over-tightening these bolts could cause binding. The bumper should pivot freely and the operating handle should not bind. Connect the bumper spring to its clasp. The fifth wheel is now reassembled and in the closed position. Check the wedge stop rod adjustment by pushing in on the exposed end of the wedge stop rod. The wedge stop rod is properly adjusted when there is a 1/4 of an inch clearance between the end of the stop rod and the wedge. Turn the rod clockwise to reduce free travel of the rod. Turn it counterclockwise to increase free travel of the rod. Open and close the fifth wheel a few times to check for smooth, free operation. The operating handle should not bind. To eliminate binding, it may be necessary to bend the operating handle slightly. This can be done using a hammer and pinch bar. The operating handle should contact the side of the cover plate when in a closed position. The end of the handle should not contact the skirt of the wheel or strike the end of the bracket retainer pin when in an open position. Next, pump a small amount of grease through the grease fittings on each side of the fifth wheel to make sure they are feeding grease to the bearing pockets. If grease does not flow, clean out the plugged holes. Now thoroughly grease the bearing pockets before installing the fifth wheel onto the mounting brackets. Now, check the lower bracket pins. The end of the bracket pin should not extend more than 1 inch from the inside bracket plate when used in a standard 5092 top plate. The low-profile 5006 model fifth wheel uses longer lower bracket pins. If these longer bracket pins are used in a standard 5092 top plate, the release handle may not properly latch open. Completely reassembled, your fifth wheel is now ready to be returned to service. With the fifth wheel in place and all the pins installed, follow the procedures outlined earlier for the 90-day or 30,000-mile lubrication and adjustment. By following these preventive maintenance procedures, a Fontaine fifth wheel will provide hundreds of thousands of miles of trouble-free performance.